Hi friends, my name is Emily and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be sharing with you my February reading wrap up. I feel like many things in the past year and a bit not going to plan. This month also did not go to plan. I had very ambitious plans because I actually took a week's vacation. I took 4 days vacation and yet I did not read all that much. Like, I had visions of myself spending that week in part on house projects and in part on reading all of the things and being like really luxurious, and like none of that happened. I read 6 things in February, starting with Moxie by Jennifer Mathieu. This was a reread. I picked it up because Gabby sent me the trailer on Instagram. There's a filmic adaptation coming out. It looks like Amy Poehler is involved in the production and she's in it. I wanted to reread the book because as I was watching the trailer, I was like, oh, everybody here is really white. Like, is that true of the book as well, or is that Hollywood happening? There's a little bit more diversity in the book, but like not that much. And the thing that we ended up talking about quite a bit was how this doesn't feel very 2016. Like, both of us kept checking the publication date and being like, is this really happening in 2017? This is the story of Vivian, whose mom was a bit of a rebel girl, bit of a riot girl in her youth, very white, feminist. There is a group of boys at Vivian's school who get away with doing all sorts of sexist crap. Like, they wear rude t-shirts and they do this thing called the bump and grab, where they accidentally bump into somebody and then touch them inappropriately. Vivian, taking inspiration from her mother's past, starts this secret zine called Moxie Girls that calls for the girls in her school to take a stance. The thing that I think we both found while we were buddy reading this was how antiquated some of this seemed. Like, it almost seemed over the top and at the same time like something that couldn't happen in 2017. Like, now I think both of us are Canadian and this is set in the American South, if I'm not mistaken. So maybe that's just a little bit of a cultural difference. But yeah, it felt really hard to wrap my mind around it being 2017 and this being set in a contemporary setting. On the reread, I have bumped this down to a 3-star. In some ways, I feel like it's an interesting starting point, and I think the reason I rated it so highly was the idea of youth taking action, these like cute zines, the example that Vivian is setting for ways to make change, ways to make a difference in your school and to speak up. I think that's in part what I really liked about it, but I think coming back at it in 2021, it doesn't feel quite as intersectional as I would like for it to be. I think it's also important to consider that the first time I read this, I was reading this for the Indigo Teen Staff Pick of the Month. I was part of the group of humans reading and voting, and so I was reading this and comparing it to another YA text with a similar feminist marketing pitch. I think by comparison, this shone more brightly than when you read it in isolation. I am really excited to see the adaptation. I would like to see if 3 or 4 years has made the Moxie Girls more intersectional, has brought forth a little more nuanced conversations. I am excited for that. I think that's coming out March 3rd. The next book that I picked up was Brown Girl Dreaming by Jacqueline Woodson. So this is a piece of middle grade nonfiction. It is a memoir in poetry. Woodson shares the experience of being raised in the South during a time of segregation, largely by her grandparents while her mother was sort of getting her shit together in, I want to say Chicago, but now I am not sure. The little snapshots of life via poetry are vivid. It's a chunker of a book, but it's so readable. Like, it's really hard to put this down. You just sort of get lost in Jacqueline's childhood and her experiences, her relationships with her family, her siblings, her grandparents, also the ways in which she is experiencing being an African American. Those are the words that she uses in the 1960s and 70s. This was a new buy. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. I think this would be a phenomenal piece to gift to young people in your life. I think it would be a fantastic addition to a classroom library or a school library. Even as an adult, it's so beautifully written. It's fantastic. I cannot recommend it enough. So please put this on your TBR. Pick up Jacqueline Woodson. The next thing that I picked up was Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. Alex is I want to say former drug addict, but we never see her go through any sort of, like, she just stops cold turkey when she's invited to this, like, secret society at Yale. She can see dead people, and she gets pulled into the Yale's secret society as a member of the secret society police, basically. And so she supervises the other secret societies in their various magics to make sure that those secret societies aren't doing abusive things. A woman is murdered on campus and everybody sort of brushes it off, and she gets this sort of itch. She needs to investigate this further, and it turns into this absolute shit show. I think the dark academia vibes are fun. I personally love sort of necromancy in fantasy literature. I like the school setting. I really like the university setting. However, I feel like there isn't much to Alex's character other than that she is a former drug addict. And like, she's very small and scrawny and sickly looking because she's had a rough life. And it was something that I didn't realize at the time. It wasn't until I was writing my notes on this for myself. Her whole identity seems to be former drug addict. That's how the people on campus view her. That's how her mother views her. And when things start, like magic things start happening to her, they are very quick to throw her under the bus because she has this history of drug abuse. So clearly she's just using again. Like, everything about her. I cannot tell you much about her other than that she's a former drug addict. So much effort went into building this really elaborate secret society system, like that Yale, the campus, is this pocket where magic collects, so you have to do magic here because the like vibrations or whatever, the energy in the earth that feeds this magic collects here. The rules around rituals, the rules around interacting with the dead, all of that magic is so fleshed out, and yet our main character is like a cardboard cutout. I do agree with the blurb. It was really hard to put down once I picked it up, but upon reflection, I have some issues with it. It's not a big enough issue that I won't pick up the second book, but if Alex doesn't develop a personality, if her character doesn't get more fleshed out, then I think I'm done with this. My initial reaction was to give this 5 out of 5 stars because, like, flying through this and getting sucked into this murder mystery and like the whimsy of necromancy on the university campus was joy. It was absolute joy. I've since reduced it down to 4 stars, and now I'm thinking that it's sitting at a 3-star. Like, it was okay. The next book that I read was Hangsaman by Shirley Jackson. So this is Shirley Jackson's second novel. I wanted to watch the loose adaptation on Amazon Prime, I believe, called Shirley. I find Shirley Jackson's horror writing fascinating. It's a pretty heavy critique of white women's roles in the domestic sphere. Like, the horror of being pigeonholed into that role. Very quickly we realized that it was going to be drawing on Hangsaman because Shirley in the film was writing this novel, and so I didn't want any spoilers in case like they played with the novel, which they do to a certain degree. So anyway, Hangsaman is about 17-year-old Natalie Waite, whose father is this pretentious asshole of a writer. They're in this like very stilted, uncommunicative family. Her mother has been boxed in as homemaker, and the father throws these elaborate weekly parties where an unknown number of guests may show up, and the mother is expected to like cook and clean and prepare and like host these parties for her husband's random acquaintances. There's this moment where he talks about how his wife fails at her wifely duties because every Sunday when he throws this party, she fails to provide him with a hot lunch. He's reduced to a sandwich, and he feels that this is some sort of reflection on her inability to wife properly. It's not the fact that she's cooking and cleaning and like preparing hors d'oeuvres and meals for the party that he's thrown later in the day that she has no interest in. No, it's a failure of her ability to wife. If that doesn't set the tone. Natalie is sexually assaulted at this party, and she buries this down. She tries to convince herself that this hasn't happened, and she goes away to an all-girls school and ends up in an interesting sort of relationship with the young wife of a young professor. So he's like the young, hot English teacher on campus, and he's always inviting students back to his place, and we learn that his young faculty wife is a former student, and she had to give up her education to be his wife. And so she sits in their on-campus housing all day and drinks to excess, and in the meantime he's fucking around with his other students and having a great time, and Natalie is sort of caught in this. And then in like true Shirley Jackson fashion, things descend into madness, and I feel like we're playing that like real or not real game that Peeta plays in the Hunger Games with Katniss for like the last bit of this novel. I don't think that's a spoiler to say because you're still going to experience it, but those are the key pieces, right? We're looking at the roles of women, what women are forced into, the sort of joke that is women's education at this point. Natalie wants to be a writer, and yet we sort of see her doomed to repeat these roles, right? Like we see that her mother also gave up on an education to be a miserable housewife. Elizabeth is just drunk all the time and miserable, and like these seem to be the examples of what happen to educated, ambitious women once they enter into marriage. Again, we sort of get a taste of the horror that we'll see in Jackson's later novels with things like We've Always Lived in the Castle. I think especially The Haunting of Hill House, where the domestic and the roles of white women become this horrific thing. I don't think this is quite horror yet. Overall, this was a really hard read. Between being pissed off at all of the men in this text and like the absolute, like I was so angry every time the father spoke or wrote, and that dick professor preying on his students and mistreating his wife. Like, I could only read so much, and then I would get so angry that I'd have to put it down. Just in terms of enjoyment, a 2 out of 5 stars. The themes here are interesting. I think this would make an excellent book club book, just because there are so many things to discuss here, especially once that descent into madness happens. The next book I read is Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson, which allows me to cross off one of my reading goals for this year, which was to finally get around to the overhyped man himself. So unpopular opinion, and I am fully prepared for the internet to come for me in the future. All comments may be held for review because I have heard that the Brandon Sanderson fans are passionate, and if you disagree that their Lord and Savior, Brandon Sanderson, is not the best writer ever, you die. You deserve to die. And I am in that camp. This was pitched to me as a book with a strong female character by folks in my real life and online. And not just like folks who read casually, but folks who read critically, like fellow academics when I was doing my master's who were into fantasy literature. They pointed at this as having a strong female character. And Vin is the biggest disappointment I have encountered in a long time. I am absolutely baffled. When I was saying that I did my dissertation on strong female characters, I wonder if folks thought that that meant like physically strong, like I can lift bags of grain strong, and not strongly written. Because Vin is a total Waschlappen. I think the most annoying thing is how many times it is repeated that Vin is small and weak. Not only by the men around her, like this narrative flips largely between Kelsier and Vin. So Vin's like, oh, gotta make myself small and invisible, tuck my legs up and be super small. And then everybody around her is like, oh, she's so teeny, she's like a child, she's just so delicate. And like the number of times that we get Vin talk about how she's not like other girls, she has short hair, she doesn't like dresses, until she gets to pretend to be a noble and then likes feeling pretty and likes having nice food and likes gossiping and dancing and like completely loses the thread of the mission. She's a hot mess. And I was so annoyed with Kelsier. He's just such patronizing little butthole, and he's leading this rebellion, and I feel like he's one of those almost Sherlock Holmes characters where he's like 20 steps ahead of everybody else. In the same way that Sherlock Holmes can be really pretentious and annoying, Kelsier is really pretentious and annoying, and the way that he thinks about Vin drives me bananas. On top of that, if you want to know how like fake science, essentially, this magic is so detailed, it's like a fake science. And if you want to know how it works, if you want to know how characters like push and pull off of metal, wow, you get a lot of descriptions of that. There were things that I enjoyed. I really am curious about the ruler. What's his name? Does he have a name? Lord Ruler. He's just Lord Ruler. Generic bad guy Lord Ruler. I'm curious about his story more so than anything that's happening. I am much more interested in like some of the world building pieces than I am in our protagonist. I finished it because it was a goal of mine to finish it, and I am debating whether or not it is worth it to continue with this first trilogy. Because it was so hyped up for me, I bought the trilogy. So when I posted on Instagram being like, does this get better? Folks were like, Brandon Sanderson cites Vin as how to not write female characters. Like he has self-reflected and looked back on her and gone, yikes, I need to do better. Is it worth it to read what I have for a little bit of context and then move on to some of his more recent works where he is apparently doing better in terms of constructing nuanced female characters? Or do you think this is just genuinely not for me, given my reaction to Mistborn? The last book that I read in February, and a thing that took up a majority of my time in between everything else, was Wizard and Glass, which is the 4th Dark Tower book. This was for the Patron live show that I hosted last night, where we talked about all of the Dark Tower goodness. Again, we can't say too much because spoilers, but this really fleshes out Midworld. I still think it's a hot mess of a book in terms of narrative construction. And I sort of off the top of my head thought about this last night. The intentionality of the hot mess nature of this book, the majority of this book is a flashback to Roland's childhood. And it breaks this super linear narrative moving towards the tower, following the path of the beam. We end up entirely off the path of the beam. Part of me feels like, in terms of narrative construction, this giant flashback would make more sense as a prequel, as something that is meant to sit outside of this quest moving forward that fleshes out the world building that all the super fans would read. I also think it would make more space for the snippets of and like overlapping points that we get with The Stand, which is another huge text within King's bibliography. Maybe it would have been interesting to spend more time in this overlap point. And I think it would feel better paced as a novel for folks who are maybe not as critical readers, like if they're just looking for that escapist epic fantasy with the forward-moving narratives that make sense, like this flashback piece within the larger themes of the series, to me, emphasizes the importance of storytelling, the important role of storytelling within this entire body of works. While it breaks the conventions of like the narrative, and I think it kind of turns the book into a hot mess, it also very much highlights and gives weight to this really important theme within the story as a whole. I mean, I've always enjoyed this book. I really love Roland's backstory. I really love getting to see the world fleshed out, but I always thought it was a hot mess, whereas at this point, with this small revelation that maybe this, taking this break, giving this weight to storytelling is actually really important for framing how to think about the upcoming 3 books. I did really enjoy this. I had a lot of fun on the live show, and I'm excited to start Wolves of the Kala and sort of continue on our quest to the tower. That was a reread for me, and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars because I think in the like scheme of these 7, 8 Dark Tower books, depending on whether or not you count The Wind Through the Keyhole as part of the series proper or sort of like an appendage, I like the backstory, but it is not super pleasurable to read just because it's sort of a clunky paced book, if that makes sense. Those are the books that I have read this month. Next month, I am hosting another drop-in book club. This time we are reading Franny and Zooey by JD Salinger, which was submitted and voted on by my patrons. If you want to join us for this live discussion of the book, you can find the link to the Patreon page in the description box down below. It is available to patrons at all tiers, so for as little as $1 a month, you can become a patron and follow along in these book club events. Thank you, patrons, for allowing me to set aside time to do stuff like this, to purchase books for review. I really appreciate that you enable me to do this. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you are doing well, that you are staying safe, and I will see you soon with another video. Bye!